Hey folks, it's 8:30, so it's time for the 8:30 live. Now, I guess we're going to wait a little bit, as we always do, for folks to start tuning in on the live stream on Facebook, because Facebook goes and alerts them. But for those watching on YouTube, I really appreciate I've been getting comments from folks who like the programming. So thank you so much for those comments. That is very, makes you feel good inside that people like what they're seeing on YouTube. And we get a lot of comments on Facebook, but that's sort of like live in the stream. So to all my Facebook friends, thank you as well for watching. I've been getting some good feedback on the show, so fantastic. And tomorrow we're going to have Zoom as promised. So maybe we'll get some folks on to talk about things that they're expert in, or maybe we'll just have a free-for-all. Nobody's really, even though I've asked, nobody's given me any suggestion on how to do that. So I think tomorrow when I ask what folks want to discuss, I'll also be asking for the top, like how they would like to see a Zoom call conducted. But that being said, now that folks are tuning in, the first thing I want to say today is my local Democratic club, Downtown Independent Democrats, is doing launching a really amazing project in concert with the COVID Foundation. The COVID Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit that has provided over that has raised over $600,000 worth of PPE for hospitals and healthcare providers in New York City. And they're teaming up with Downtown Independent Democrats to raise money to provide PPE at cost to residents of Lower Manhattan. Soon, ideally, to be expanded to the rest of New York City after this pilot program is concluded. So if you want more information about that, or you want to donate, and Downtown Independent Democrats is matching every donation right now, 1-to-1, doubling every donation up to $1,000. You can do that at bit.ly, so bit.ly/downtown PPE. That's capital D, capital P, capital P, and capital E, because Bitly really cares about, it's case sensitive. So that URL again is bit.ly/downtown PPE, and that's a capital D on downtown, a capital P, a capital P, and a capital E on PPE. And again, we're getting PPE and such at cost from the COVID Foundation, and this will be packaged and distributed by volunteers. If you want to volunteer, you can also head to that website. And a $10 donation will provide a family of 4 enough masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer for 2 weeks. So I think this is a really, really fantastic and amazing project. And I really think that if it does well in Lower Manhattan, we'll be able to roll it out to even larger swaths of the city where, PPE is really, really needed. I think, if you're interested in participating, please just let me know. Please check out the website and be in touch. And if you want to volunteer in packaging the PPE or distributing the PPE, there's absolutely a role for you to do that. If you can donate, again, bit.ly/downtown PPE, capital D, and then a capital PPE. Okay, so I'll probably mention that again on point during tonight, but I just think it's the coolest thing, because now we all have something we can do to really help residents of Lower Manhattan, residents of New York City. And of course, the foundation will be prioritizing essential workers, the elderly, and folks who are most at risk. And so Downtown Independent Democrats is compiling that list of people, and we're going to just get this PPE at cost and distribute it to everybody in Lower Manhattan. Just really fantastic. So a couple of other top line things, I guess, in terms of folks' safety and sanitation. Big news, real big news. Governor's shutting down the subway. Not all the time, but for the first time in its history, New York City is going to be shutting down the subway at night. So now we're no better than London. The subway will be shutting down between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. And, basically you can't get on it. This has never happened before. We've been through 2 world wars and a Great Depression and never had the subway shut down. Although, to be fair, the 2 world wars were somewhere else. So, that being said, this is the first time the subway is shutting down at night. New Yorkers really, really love to lord it over every other city, none of which has a 24-hour subway system. I know there's some Boston folks on right now, so you can laugh at us. That's fine. We're in the same boat as you now. The rationale for this is the subway, one, ridership is down a lot. We're talking like ridership is at 5%. They want to protect the MTA workers who are forced to continue operating the subway, so taking fewer risks with the health of MTA workers. And then the subways have become quite dirty and slightly more dangerous because of all the homeless people who are now using them as a shelter. I mean, this was always sort of the case, but now with nobody on the subways, particularly in the late hours, homeless folks just sort of camp out all night long. And we've spoken about this before on the live, and there have been a lot of people who have been vocal and perhaps a bit misunderstanding of the situation of the homeless during this pandemic. And personally, my position is the number one way to get homeless people off the subway is not to chase them off by shutting down the subways and then shooting them with, basically making it incapable of them to stay there by hosing down the subway cars, so they have to go somewhere else, but to really provide them someplace they'd rather be, because ultimately folks don't want to be on the subway. They want to be someplace that's warm with a comfortable bed where they can sleep for a few hours. But the fact that New York doesn't provide this means that we have to kick everybody off the subway. And there's two important caveats here. The first is that the governor said that the question of they're doing this as well so they can disinfect the subways or clean them. They've been cleaning them every 72 hours. Every car's been getting cleaned every 72 hours. So with the subway shutting down, they're bumping that up to once every 24 hours. But the governor did say that there's some difficulty in figuring out what the right protocol is for disinfecting the subway, which cleaning and disinfecting are not the same thing. So maybe it was a slip, but it kind of implies they haven't been disinfecting the subway. They've just been cleaning it. So we'll see how this goes, but ultimately the subway is closing. And for the essential workers that still need to go to their jobs and work the late shift, the state will be rolling out a series of other alternatives for transportation. One is the bus system. That will still be operational. The buses, of course, are now nowhere near as cool or as fast as the subway, but perhaps with so much less traffic on the street, there'll be fewer. Certainly, the number one delayer of buses has gone away. The other thing is that the MTA, and I have yet to see any proposal for how this is actually going to work in practice, but the MTA will be covering ride sharing purchases by essential workers and taxis. So that would be really cool. And then the third thing is that they'll have the dollar vans, which have been operating. And the dollar vans are essentially illegal buses. And the state and city have spent an awful lot of time in the past trying to shut them down and ticket them out of existence. But now they're part of the critical infrastructure of New York City, particularly now that the subways are going out. So again, subways closed 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. To make up for it for essential workers, there will be bus access, compensated ride sharing and taxi rides, and the dollar vans will continue to operate. The only thing that I really wonder about is what's going to happen to the MTA workers. Now, I believe that all of them are salaried. I don't think that they work on an hourly basis, but I wonder if this means that there'll be furloughing or reduction in pay for the MTA night shifters who won't be working. What I can absolutely say is that nighttime workers get a bonus for working at night. I believe it's time and a half. This is not overtime. Like, they just get a nighttime differential. So folks who have built their lives and rely on that extra 1.5 pay, they're going to probably be seeing a lot less money as a result. So this all feeds into budget cuts and reduced spending by the state, which translates into less consumer purchasing power by residents of New York, which then feeds a downward spiral of economic activity. And we've spoken about that many, many times. But this is one of those things where just doing maybe the safe thing or changing the way that the workforce is structured in New York has a similar impact. It's not all from budget cuts. Some of it is just from the fact that services change and the state's spending reduces as a result. Now, we've got some comments. We've got one from Deirdre Levy. I have two from Deirdre, in fact. She says, and Deirdre's a teacher in New York. She says, I've been on the subway and it has not been it has been a good experience. There weren't a lot of people. Everyone is maintaining social distance. However, I was not traveling during late hours. There are Facebook groups of MTA workers continuously writing furious posts about how the amount of homeless people defecating and sleeping in the subways has been putting their lives at risk. Thank you for that update, Deidre. I'm curious to know where you heard all these Facebook posts, or are you just happen to be friends with a bunch of MTA workers? I can absolutely say that reports from other people that I know indicate that the subways feel less safe, and certainly we know from a simply statistical perspective that in New York we benefit from safety in numbers, and that when there are large spaces with almost nobody around, crime actually goes up because criminals are emboldened when they're not worried about being caught. But this was, we spoke about that on a previous live because actually crime stats are up for the subway. And of course, this is an interplay with the fact that, one, Governor Cuomo has been itching for a reason to fill the subways with police. And two, it interplays with the fact that right now there's a huge effort to depopulate the prisons because the coronavirus is spreading rapidly through those close quarters, and it's just a very unsafe environment. So the fact that crime is up in the subways is actually in tension with the fact that we're trying to get folks out of the prison system, and the fact that we have this history, this legacy of a government which looks for reasons to apply police pressure to the citizenry. Deidre also says, I would not want to put our essential workers at risk because there are issues with health and safety. However, it's important to make sure that the homeless are safe. Their safety equals our safety. And yes, absolutely that. Actually, Deidre commented the other night that she was out with a slice of pizza and a homeless person came up to ask her for change, and she ended up giving the pizza, one, because he needed food, and two, because it cut short an interaction in which she was less than 6 feet away from another person whose, coronavirus status she didn't know. So if we take care of the homeless, then they won't be vectors for the coronavirus. And really, we want everybody to be safe and healthy. So providing them an opportunity to get out of the cold, to be in a setting where they can maintain their distance from other folks and they don't have to panhandle, they can get food and they can get clothing and they can get shelter. That honestly is an efficacious way for the government to keep the rest of us safe, right? Because if we have folks who are at high risk of catching coronavirus, and we know that the coronavirus is highly transmissible, and we know that the folks who are most at risk of having it are also likely to approach healthy people on the street, then we're in a bad spot. So yes, I completely agree with you that we do want to keep our essential workers safe, but that also keeping homeless people safe serves that very interest. And Julianne says, you are right in wondering if they've been disinfecting. I was watching the briefing. He continually said that they didn't know how to do it. That is to say, disinfect the subway. This implies, this implies that they most definitely have not been disinfecting the subway. His actions need to be an investigation. I think what you're saying is there needs to be an investigation into this. And if the governor has been saying that we've been cleaning the subway every 72 hours and giving a false sense of security that they've been disinfecting the subway every 72 hours, and he knows that there's a difference between the two, and he hasn't been saying that until today, I really do believe there's probably an investigation that needs to be done into that, because it's needlessly putting people at risk to say that the subways are safe or that they're being taken care of, when in fact the governor knows they aren't. That being said, I can't see what's so difficult about it. They have high pressure water guns. They can pump out high heat. and mix it with soap, and I think you're good to go. But I'm not an epidemiologist, so what the hell do I know? But if bleach, well, you can't really mix high heat and bleach. You got to get the masks. Anyway, whatever. I really hope they figure out how to disinfect the subway cars. We have been promised that the subway will probably be the cleanest it's ever been. So I'm really excited when this is all over for people from Washington, D.C. to come here and shut up about how dirty our subway is and how nice their, quote, subway system is in Washington. Deidre also says the Facebook group is called Progressive Action. Well, isn't that fitting? So for folks who are interested in hearing what MTA workers are saying about their working conditions, head over to the link that Deidre popped in, Progressive Action. Matt Kozlowski. What's up? Hi, Ben. I have a question for you. How would you grade capitalist societies versus socialist societies versus democratic socialist societies in handling the COVID crisis and pandemic response? This is a great question. And before I launch into it, I just want to remind folks, because there's so many more watching now, that Downtown Independent Democrats is launching a program to provide at-cost PPE to Lower Manhattan as a pilot program with the COVID Foundation. If it's successful, COVID Foundation will be rolling this out to the rest of the city, which will mean that donations to the COVID Foundation will resolve in PPE for the most needy in our communities. $10 supplies 2 weeks worth of hand sanitizer, masks, and gloves to residents of New York City. So if you want to participate in this pilot program, please head to bit.ly/downtown PPE. That's bit.ly/downtown PPE, capital D on downtown, capital P, capital P, capital E. Okay, now to Matt's question. Well, I suppose the answer is really less about the economic structure of the country and more about how responsive the government is. So we don't really have any socialist countries in the world. I mean, we have several democratic socialist societies, and they have performed very, very well. We also have a number of real socialist or communist countries like China, and they seemingly have dealt with the pandemic well in a short period of time, although we don't really know what the situation in China was. And then we have capitalist countries, but even our capitalist countries are mixed economies. So the United States isn't capitalist. It is a mixed economy. It just is slightly more or substantially more maybe on the capitalist side than, say, the social democracies of Europe. But Singapore, which seems to have handled the pandemic quite well, is very capitalist. The biggest differentiator between whether or not a society is capable of dealing with the coronavirus seems to be trust in government. And the thing that the United States seriously suffers from right now is a very low trust in government. That means that capitalist, individualist, communist, collectivist, socialist, socialist democracy or social democracy, the main difference is the degree to which people are willing to take the advice of experts, professionals, and the government. And this takes us actually to the next big thing that I wanted to cover in the news, which is Michigan. Michigan is in a state of emergency, and the governor has issued stay-at-home orders. This is Governor Whitmer. Now, today, there was a gigantic protest against the stay-at-home orders. Those stay-at-home orders were issued to the population in order to keep them safe. But because the people of Michigan, not the people, because a minority of people in Michigan do not believe or do not have faith in the government, and because to some extent the response to coronavirus has broken down on partisan, that is to say political, not scientific lines, about hundreds of people showed up at the Capitol today to cram into a very small space and protest the state of emergency and the stay-at-home orders. Now, what makes this really, really beyond interesting, really sort of outrageous and dangerous is the fact that because Michigan is an open carry state, people were open carrying their AK-47s, their AR-15s, their handguns, their rifles. People were showing up with guns. It got to the point that legislators were showing up to the Capitol to vote on legislation in bulletproof vests. Now, I'm sure the position of the folks watching this on gun control are of a relatively similar persuasion. But I will say that whether or not you believe that the Second Amendment confers an individual right to gun ownership, I find it very, very hard to make any sort of constitutional argument that it encourages you or allows you to bring your firearms to the place of debate and into the legislature. Let's just be absolutely clear about what's happening here. People are bringing their guns to a peaceful protest about something not to do with guns. I almost understand the desire to bring your firearm and show that it can be borne peacefully at a rally to do with gun rights. But if you're bringing your firearm to a rally that has nothing to do with guns, it can only have one real interpretation, which is I am prepared to use this weapon to influence the outcome of this debate. And all those people who are saying that firearms are our defense against tyranny, everybody in that Capitol building who's voting on legislation is a duly elected representative of the public, chosen through democratic processes. The only tyranny you're seeing in Michigan's Capitol is from people who are threatening to use violence or trying to intimidate the legislature into doing what they want through violence. That is tyranny. And those are the people carrying the guns into the Capitol to influence democratic decision-making through the threat of violence. They are tyrannical. And I would say that is not really borderline, but almost definitionally terrorism. Terrorism is the use of fear to accomplish political objectives. It doesn't really matter whether you kill people. The threat of killing is in itself the inspiration of terror for political means. So, I do understand that Michigan is an open carry state, but I really worry about the situation when people are carrying firearms for no other reason than to make a statement that either I get what I want or I might shoot somebody. All right, so there are probably some comments on this, but let's see what's going on. Oh, we've got one going back to the point about Andrew Cuomo and the cleaning of the subways. So I will read this from Julianne, and this is referring to Governor Cuomo. His cracks are beginning to show. The wall of love that was made of masks was so moronic and misuse of valuable PPE. So in case you didn't watch the governor's press conference, he had a whole wall that was just masks that had been made by other people. And the idea here being, hey, those could have been used. If I had sent masks and saw them thumbtacked to a board that the governor could parade around, I would be angry. I mean, I don't know whether or not people are angry about that. They were pretty much all homemade masks. But that being said, another perfect opportunity to mention that Downtown Independent Democrats is raising money and matching donations to pay for at-cost PPE for residents of New York City. bit.ly/downtown PPE. Capital D on downtown, capital P, capital E. And yeah, the caps lock is important. Deirdre says, not sure if you talked about this, but would you be able to speak about de Blasio's announcement to the, quote, Jewish community re-social distancing? I haven't spoken about that, and there are a lot of folks who have weighed in on this all over the internet. And my position is not particularly different from theirs, which is that Bill de Blasio's tweet to the, quote, Jewish community and others is incredibly tone deaf at best, disturbing in the middle, and just downright evil at worst. Singling out the Jewish community and saying, I'm going to send the cops to break up all of your events has really, really negative parallels. And the fact that you add and others into your tweet is basically the same as Donald Trump coming out, for me, Donald Trump coming out at the beginning of his campaign and saying, Mexicans are not sending their best people. They're sending rapists and murderers and drug dealers. And some, I assume, are good people. You can't just caveat the fact that some people are good when you've singled out a minority for bad behavior and said you're going to sick the police on them. And that these people are, and then implying that all these people are putting the rest of the society at risk by their actions. That's just freaking, it's just so goddamn dangerous and just the wrong tack. And mind you, the statement that the mayor made was about a minority of a minority of a minority. So the Jewish community as a whole is absolutely accepting social distancing, has no problem, has caused no problem, puts nobody at risk through their actions. A minority of that minority, the Orthodox, the Hasids, also don't have a problem and have done their minions, are doing the remote distancing, the social distancing thing and conducting things remotely. This is a minority, however, which often gets a bad rap in New York City politics because they happen to operate as a voting bloc and thereby extract concessions from politicians because of their very organized nature. Now, of that minority is a minority of that Orthodox community which is not adhering to social distancing practices. But for Bill de Blasio to call out the Jewish community and say that they're putting everybody else at risk through their, basically implying their religious practices and saying that the police are going to come and lock you up, is sending such a terrible message with such terrible historical overtones that, other people have said it more eloquently, but there is nothing but a PR disaster in that tweet. And honestly, I don't know what Bill de Blasio feels in his heart, but how he came to the conclusion that that was an okay thing to say is well beyond me. I hope that answers your question, but for those who are unfamiliar with the tweet, I just want to be really clear about this because I've been referencing it and making allusions to sort of what it said, but the tweet explicitly said, actually, you know what? I'm going to pull it up so I can read it to you, because if you don't know what it said, you really should. And it's a testament to the times that these are the sort of conversations that we're having. And Donald Trump really kicked it all off. And I think maybe even in Bill de Blasio's mind, he might have thought that it was fine, but the framing of issues has just become so skewed because of the language and rhetoric that we're used to hearing that maybe in his mind, he actually was like, yeah, this doesn't sound so bad. I've heard worse. I've heard a lot worse. And I want to sound strident. So I'm going to call out the people who, quote, need to be called out. But let's just open up this tweet and see what he has to say, because I think that most people would agree that this is just absolutely unacceptable language from our elected leaders. And I don't know why you would write an article and not have a quote of the tweet in there. That just seems silly. So instead, I'm going to just, here we go. My message to the Jewish community and all communities is this simple. The time for warnings has passed. I have instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping the disease and saving lives, period. Well, if this was to all communities, why single out the Jewish community? And this is part of a running thread of people believing that the Orthodox community is willing to put others at risk to satisfy their own desires, because this comes on the heel of vaccine resistance and measles outbreaks in Orthodox communities that Bill de Blasio also sent the police to deal with and required that people receive vaccines to if they were going to continue to have schooling in their districts. So this is really hot on the heels of a thread of comments about the behavior of the Orthodox community relative to the government and relative to what would be considered public safety. And Bill de Blasio, again, calling out a minority of a minority of a minority in a tweet meant for everybody is just terrible, just terrible. Julianne says. Another issue that came up today was Bloomberg. Okay, switching gears, I guess. We did sort of really go into although if there's other comments on the Bill thing, we'll get to them. Another issue that came up today is Bloomberg. COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities. The person who oversaw stop and frisk is now in charge of tracing and isolating those who have possibly been exposed to COVID-19. This should be a concern to everyone. I can see this going very, very badly. Well, I will say this. I did not know that. And that does seem like they put somebody in charge of checking in on Black and brown communities who has little regard for the civil rights of Black and brown communities. And so you might end up with a very similar situation in the near future to this tweet to the Jewish community insofar as the contact tracing in Black and brown communities, because ultimately contact tracing is going to be an important part of stemming the spread of the pandemic. And if the people you put in charge of working backwards through the network do not have the trust of the community you're trying to trace and don't care much for the rights of the people they're contacting, you're gonna have a bad situation. You're gonna have a situation where the community is recalcitrant or hesitant to pony up information, fearing civil rights abuses, and then you're going to get an increasingly harsh response from a team whose job it is to secure the public safety by getting information and extracting information from that community and then quarantining people it finds. So yeah, that's pretty disturbing. I guess we're going to have to see how it goes. And Bloomberg, of course, being absolutely, people feel varying ways about his time as mayor, but certainly he's very clearly disregards the sort of the feelings and, again, civil liberties of Black and brown communities. Leave it to Bloomberg, who earnestly in his heart doesn't give a shit, to pick that person to run the program. And by the way, in case you were wondering, the reason Bloomberg's running the program is because he's ponying up the dough. Money talks, friends. Matt Kozlowski, excellent take on the Michigan events today, Ben. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate that. Dorian Key, on a theory level, let's put the click more. On a theory level, why do you think countries like Canada, Denmark, New Zealand, Germany, Finland, Switzerland have in general better confidence in their government and less corruption and higher competency than the US, which is more on par with countries like Italy, Spain, which is more on par with countries like Italy and Spain. The UK also has this problem. This is a really great question, and it gets at the heart of what separates the United States and these other countries, because Denmark, New Zealand, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, they all have, and Germany, are all pretty, you'd probably put them in that bucket of European social democracy. However, Italy and Spain also kind of fall into that bucket, much more so the United States. The UK is much more like the US from an economic perspective. But then what is it about all these countries? Like, how do you define what it is that's led to this erosion in trust of government? And I think one of the big components that's unique to the United States, and I've spoken about this before, and certainly relative to, and Germany is actually beginning to experience this, is that the United States is under, our elections, our democracy is under constant attack from corporate America and from corporate interests and from wealthy interests. And I really don't want this to go unsaid or misunderstood. So one of the things that I did years and years ago was a startup that dealt in the aggregation of small dollar donors to influence politicians. So you would aggregate small dollars into a bundle and say, everybody will donate at once, basically in exchange for this. Like, we want you to take this position. And in the course of that startup, I did a lot of research into money in politics and into lobbying and how much lobbying is done, not just in the United States, but around the world. And one of the more interesting things to find is that the United States is really the only country where money in politics is a humongous issue. And this is both contributions to candidates and to lobbying. So the hiring of lobbyists to to contact politicians on behalf of corporations while they're in office. But the United States is not the only country that has private contributions to politicians. In fact, there are many countries where there are no limits on contributions to politicians. It's just that nobody gives that much money. And there are countries like Israel where they don't even limit the contributions to citizens of that country. At least in the United States, you have to be a citizen of the United States to make a contribution to a politician. Now, of course, we've seen the barriers between money and politicians erode over time through things like Citizens United and the creation of super PACs and independent expenditures. But one of the really key things to understand is that the United States is under constant assault, and it's under constant assault because it is a global superpower. All right? Everything the United States does, every policy it passes, every tax rate it changes, everything it decides to do, every contract it writes, these are all of incredible importance to the business community. The federal budget spends a ridiculous amount of money. The state budgets spend more. Many states spend more than entire countries in Europe. And so corporate interests and wealthy interests are constantly assailing the US and using their money to distract and divide the American electorate. And so I'm going to give one counterexample in Germany and then two examples here in the United States. So one of the things that I read recently, or not so recently, but maybe it's a couple years old, was about lobbying in Germany. And Germany was saying that they are unprepared for an American-style politics, but that lobbying is picking up in Berlin. And the question is, well, why has lobbying begun to take on a bigger life in German politics? And I think the answer is very, very obvious. Germany is becoming the de facto capital of Europe. It is the main economic driver. It has the largest budget. But more importantly than that, it sets the agenda for regulation across the EU and the use of the EU budget. And most importantly, it is effectively the underwriter of the ECB, the European Central Bank. Now, during the Euro crisis and really many other circumstances, it's the underwriting of the ECB by Germany's economy that allows for lending by the ECB to take place. So first it was Greece and Italy taking out loans using the euro as its currency vehicle, which means that as long as Germany is involved in the Eurozone, you don't have to worry about the devaluation of the euro. Now, I'm not going to, maybe I will get into what how devaluation impacts your debt rating. But what this effectively meant was that because Germany underwrites the shared currency of the euro, if you are a country with a weaker economy, you benefit by having investors willing to loan you money in euros. Because if I loan you 100 euros today and you pay me back 120 euros tomorrow, the value of that money is going to stay pretty constant. I'm not going to get a situation where the 120 euros, suddenly the value of the euro drops off a cliff and my 120 euros is worth, what 50 euros would have been. The value of my loan is pretty safe. And this means that interest rates for borrowing go down because the risk goes down. And again, it's all underpinned by Germany. If Germany leaves the EU, leaves the Eurozone, or decides not to bail out countries that have borrowed beyond their limits, i.e. the Euro crisis, then many, many investors lose money. They get hosed. And so what Germany decides to do matters a lot. And as the value or the importance of what Germany's policy decisions are increases, so too does the lobbying. So now let's take it back to the United States. Since 1945, the United States has had the largest economy, the most spending, the fastest growing large economy in the world, and has been the main setter of global policy, not just American policy, which because the United States has such a large market becomes de facto global policy, but also the policies of the global institutions, the UN, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, all of these things are driven by the United States. So Germany is just beginning to get a taste of what it's like to have people care about what you do. The United States has been assaulted by private and special interests since, for the last 100 years as it's grown in power. So this is one of the main reasons that the United States has such a difficult time. It is also the reason that countries like Russia target the United States and sow division, because as a geopolitical enemy, there is no one bigger than the United States. So trust in government has been eroded by corporate interests, which have sown discontent amongst the population, and foreign adversaries, which have sown discontent amongst the population. And by the way, I don't want this to sound like a conspiracy theory. This is very much out in the open, and the United States has done exactly the same thing to other countries. Hundreds of millions and billions of dollars were spent by the CIA on art. Why? It was to fund artists who sowed discontent and disillusionment with the Soviet government. So this is all pretty standard course. Just know that the United States has been attacked by this and assaulted by this model of politics for many, 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 many years. And with conservative victories in cutting budgets and reducing resources for education, it becomes increasingly difficult for the American population to repel these influences, even as the absolute spending and value of influencing things in this way goes up. So resources for education go down, capacity of the population to respond intelligently or critically goes down, and at the same time, investment in these practices is going up. So that is one of the main reasons the United States, I think, has fared uniquely poorly in this. And honestly, it's federalism that saves us. Now, why why Spain and Italy having similar, and the UK having similar issues? Well, the UK, also being a financial hub, has had similar situations. And I will say there's something cultural to the United Kingdom and the United States in their individualism. But then what's to do with Spain and Italy, which have very different cultures, very different style of governments than the United States and the UK? Well, there I would just say that it is their relatively, they suffer, I think, from their overborrowing in the heady days of the EU. So I was referring just a second ago to the Euro crisis. And I think that first, I just take a moment to appreciate that the Euro crisis was not a long time ago, and it should have been the crisis of our times, or at least the European crisis of our times. The fact that it wasn't is absolutely insane. And I don't actually know what the resolution to the Euro crisis was, because now we're in Donald Trump crisis and pandemic crisis. But the ultimate effect of the Eurozone collapse because of their failure to form a banking union put Greece and Italy and Spain in really, really weak financial positions. This led to massive layoffs. And I think that what you're seeing now in the inequality here in the United States, that's being brought to light and it's feeding discontent. But the reason the United States is so fractured is different from the reason we have discontent that's, become highlighted by that fracture. Italy, Spain, and Greece have really, 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 I don't know if you all can hear this, but we've got our emergency responders going by, so good on them. Really hope they save whoever it is they're out to help. Because, the sirens just keep wailing by, and it gets, it's a rough night. It's cold in New York. It's rainy in New York. Man, they're doing the Lord's work. Not that I'm a particularly religious person, but they're doing the Lord's work. But getting back to Italy, Spain, and Greece, there has been tremendous amount of economic inequality, both within those countries and within the EU. And even though in the United States, we're completely inured to the fact that New York and California produce large chunks of the GDP of the United States, pay in tax revenue, and then that is used to supplement social programs in southern states that are far less productive. In the EU, their union, is nowhere near as used to or okay with that redistribution of resources. So as I mentioned about German policy being important, because what they do in terms of underwriting the euro has tremendous impact on the other countries in the EU. The thing to understand is that Germany's backing of the EU is not unconditional. Germany's backing out and backing up and bailing out of financially imprudent states like like Greece, Italy, and Spain is not unconditional, the way the federal government will simply bail out almost any state. Now, I understand that Mr. Connell's like, let the states go bankrupt or what have you, but functionally speaking, though, as long as the United States exists as a union, and maybe that dissolves now, who the hell knows, but as long as it exists as a union, the states aren't going to be left on their own by the federal government. It's just not going to happen. That's what makes the United States the United States. In fact, the birth of the United States was built around the assumption of Revolutionary War debt, and that was Alexander's grand plan, which created a true banking union and fiscal union of the states against the demands of Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton's vision of a true federal union won out, and it's been the model ever since. That's not the case in Europe. And so the inequality that's resulted from the divergent economies of the rich states like Denmark, like Germany, like Finland and Switzerland, and the less well-off states like Greece, Italy, and Spain has led to massive, massive discontent as the wealthier states have told the poorer states in financial crisis to cut their workforces, to raise taxes, to undertake austerity politics and austerity budgeting, to cut all social services. As people have lost their jobs and lost their government services and have been left basically on their own at the behest of the wealthy northern states in Europe, you have populism taking root. So in some regards, there are similar trends. Populism is ascendant. The argument is, of course, the divergence between rich and poor and the growth of inequality. But the underlying reasons for them are very, very different. The United States didn't have to be a country where inequality led to tremendous pain amongst the poor. It just happened to be something that was driven, and then those divisions were played up by corporate powers, by corporations, I guess, and foreign powers. Whereas the makings of this was really structurally within the failure of Europe to fully integrate because they're doing it piecemeal. I hope that addressed your question. We touched on a lot of things there, and ultimately grouping the United States and the UK with those southern EU countries, and then grouping Canada and New Zealand with the northern EU countries, I don't think really does justice to the fact that the emergence of populism in Europe is one of European integration, and the emergence of populism in the United States and the UK, well, UK, it is European integration. There's a component of that. Really, in the United States, it's one of economic inequality that's fed and propagated through both corporate power and wealthy interests manipulating our democracy, a democracy that's not been able to cope with it for decades, about 100 years even, and then influenced by foreign powers. Dorian goes on, not only just in COVID responses, but entire governance and society in general. Yes, massive divergences with how they are able to cope with things. Dorian also says, and oh boy, we're going to take it back up top for a second. I support de Blasio breaking up the Hasidic gatherings in Williamsburg. That was absolutely ridiculous, Ben. It was disgraceful. Now, listen, I got no problem with de Blasio breaking up large gatherings. However, his tweet was, in theory, not just to the Hasidic community, but to everyone. The Hasids are not the only ones gathering in mass, in massive groups, okay? We've got lots of people who refuse to acknowledge social distancing. We've got Prospect Park and lots of parks on sunny days packed with hipsters and young people and also all manner of folk. This is not something that's unique to the Jewish community. And in fact, as I mentioned, the vast, vast majority of the Jewish community is not involved. It is a minority of a minority of a minority. It's a minority of the Jewish community. It's a minority of the Orthodox community. And making it sound like Jews are to blame for this is just absolutely irresponsible. It's completely outside. It's beyond the pale, right? Like, okay, you want this to be for everybody? Make it for everybody. You want to call out the Jews? Then go out there and tell, get on the young people, get on the white people, get on everybody, all right? Because this is not really a Jewish problem. Dorian says, just because you are Jewish, Ben, you cannot defend the Hasidic gatherings, which was dangerous and irresponsible. Again, I'm not defending the gatherings. I'm just saying that the Jews are not the ones doing this, right? Okay, there are some Hasids who are not observing social distances, and there are a lot of other groups that do not observe social distancing either. And just to draw attention to the fact that the Hasids aren't doing it and to call them out and say, we're going to start sending police to arrest all of you. Well, I really hope you're planning to arrest all those fucking assholes, all those people in the parks sitting around within 6 feet of each other with no masks. So Deidre adding in, calling out the Jewish community is unacceptable, but everyone should be held accountable for breaking social distancing rules, not just Jewish people. And Dorian replies, obviously, it's not all Jews, or even 1% of Jews, but the event itself was a disgrace. Okay, but I go back to the fact that, for me, Bill de Blasio's statement is the equivalent of Donald Trump saying all Mexicans are racist, rapists, and drug dealers, right? The fact that he said, and some, I assume, are good people, as an afterthought, doesn't make his statement not racist. It does. His statement is still racist. His statement was still, the Mexicans are bad. They shouldn't come here because they're all drug dealers, murderers, and rapists. And by the way, some might be okay. Like, that doesn't make it okay. You can't go on Twitter and say, my message to the Jews is that they should not gather, and I'm going to send the police to them, and they're responsible for the problems we're experiencing. Also, everybody else. Just throwing that in there. Could be other people, too. I mean, if this were Donald Trump saying it, we'd be shouting that it's dog whistle politics. The fact that it's Bill de Blasio saying it doesn't change my mind. People, if the Jewish community that is your job as the mayor is to go to them and make sure that they hear Twitter is you have workers, and the NYPD, mind you, was a participant in that mass gathering and had okayed it. The NYPD. Now you got a problem with that. You're the mayor. You don't get on social media, blast a minority group that has a long, long history with being ostracized and blamed for pandemics and then having their door knocked on by law enforcement. You don't get on the horn and blast them publicly. Maybe you should have thought about talking to them when the NYPD approved their gathering, because you're in charge of the NYPD. You're the mayor. The NYPD works for you. If you don't want the NYPD approving large gatherings, you should think about that before you try to punish people for violating your edicts. Dorian says, I saw those photos and it was packed. And I can simply only reiterate what I've said already. Julianne says, the problem isn't with religion, but a person's relationship to their religion. The issue to me, at least, is fundamentalism. Even then, like, okay, you've got fundamentalists. And yeah, maybe they'll disregard. Like, we've got Christians in the South doing this. Why doesn't Bill de Blasio yell about Ohioans who are not social distancing and continue to go to church, and then maybe they come here and spread the virus, right? Why isn't he calling out Christians left and right? Like, there's just no, there's fundamentalists all over the place. And even then, you want to enforce the law, go enforce the law. The paper wants to report that somebody filed suit because you violated their First Amendment right by having the NYPD break up their little gathering. That's a different story. Getting on Twitter and saying that this religious group is a problem and I'm sending the cops, that's a different story. Deidre says, there are so many ignorant people out there posting quote, round up the Jews, the quote, the Jews never follow the rules. And this is true. You also have to be sensitive to the fact of the context. Anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. Attacks against Jews is at an all-time high. So this only feeds that and makes it sound like they have the cover of our elected officials to ostracize or pick on a minority group. Let's not forget that before this pandemic went down, there were already attacks on Jews in Brooklyn, random just punch outs of people who were doing nothing else but wearing a kippah or having payas. So, just we have to keep this all in perspective. And I would say the same thing about calling coronavirus the Chinese virus, right? Like that is racist. And people might be like, well, the virus came from China. And what about, Ebola? Ebola is a place. What about dengue fever? What about MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome? Okay, but in the current context, what I like to do sometimes is just pretend and substitute another ethnicity for the one that's being used and ask, is it okay? So in this context, I want you to imagine if Trump got up there and said the Mexican virus. Now that would have a quite a specific connotation, wouldn't it? Based on the way he's treated Mexicans. So the rule of thumb I like to use is if it's not okay for the most demonized group, it's not okay for any group. We shouldn't be demonizing any groups, mind you, but that's how I like to think about it. So in this context, you shouldn't be calling out minorities for being particular spreaders of a virus. Matt Kozlowski, it has nothing to do with religion, with all due respect, in my view. It is strictly public safety, health safety issue. I agree. It is completely a public safety, health safety issue, which is why you should call upon the public to, why didn't the tweet just start at, to all communities, it's that simple. To all communities, it's this simple. The time for warnings has passed. Why not start there? Why call out the Jews? I agree it's not about religion. So if it's not about religion, why mention a religious group? Deidre says, by calling out the, quote, Jewish community, de Blasio turned it into a religious issue, even though it is a public safety health issue. And Dorian, now going all the way back up to the stop and frisk stuff, and we're doing contact tracing funded by Bill de Blasio. Bill de Blasio has apparently chosen the person who headed up stop and frisk to run the contact tracing. And of course, coronavirus afflicts mainly Black and brown communities, which stop and frisk also mainly afflicted. Dorian says, Julianne, stop and frisk was overwhelmingly successful, certainly in curtailing people's civil rights. That college girl, Tessa Majors, who was stabbed and murdered in Morningside Heights by the 14-year-old Black boy robbing her, might not have happened if stop and frisk was in place with the police presence. Anything's possible, but I just don't see how one could draw that conclusion. However you look at it, stop and frisk was a violation of civil rights. There's not a really, let me tell you. So in 7th grade, I had a social studies assignment and we studied and read the Miranda case. And the whole thing hinged around probable cause, reasonable suspicion. And, one of the benefits of just making your descriptions of suspects, Black male between the heights of 5 foot and 12 feet tall, between 0 and 1 million pounds, is you can stop anybody on an APB. But, it's simply not the way the United States is meant to run, where the police can pull over anybody and frisk them. I really don't, to some extent, it's not even about safety. It's about fundamental civil rights. Now, of course, police presence matters, and whether or not you have cops around does make a difference. But what also makes a difference is whether police are respected by the community and communities are respected by the police. And if you want to do things like undercover work and real police work to find suspects, which, by the way, applies just as well to contact tracing. If you want to work with communities to solve their problems, a persistent violation of civil rights is not the way to do it. And mind you, ostensibly, this was about drugs and broken windows. But insofar as drugs, white people are much bigger users of drugs, or at least on par with the African American population. So targeting Black and brown communities, it was ultimately decided disparate impact, right? So it was, the Supreme Court would agree, violation of civil rights. Bloomberg said 96% of all violent crimes are committed by Black or Hispanic people. Literally only 4% of violent crimes are done by whites, Asians, etc. Okay. And even if that stat were true, and just because Bloomberg said it, I don't know. I can't disregard it offhand because I don't know the answer. But what I do know is that if it takes more work to solve that problem without violating civil rights, we should be doing that. And I know for a fact that it's true because we are seeing lowest crime rates we've ever seen in all of New York's history. Is what we've seen like the last 5 or 10 years. So we're doing something right, and we haven't had stop and frisk, and maybe it is taking care of our poor that leads them to not commit crimes. Maybe it's funding education. I don't know what it is. I think there's a lot of really interesting literature out there. There's a really interesting case put forward in Freakonomics, which says that a large population of young people who have nothing to do, who don't have jobs and have no prospects, leads to civil unrest. Okay, but it's not the stop and frisk that brought the crime rate down. Okay, so we need to really get to the bottom of what it is that makes people not commit crimes and not go back to crimes after they've been released from prison if they are put there. But violating people's civil rights seems a bit unnecessary to me. Deidre Levy, replying to Dorian, I'm not sure if bringing up the murder of Tessa Majors could be correlated to stop and frisk. I hope that we are trying to learn from our lessons from the Harlem Central Park 5. Also replying, Deidre says, and attaching race to these statistics further hurts these communities and continues to promote racism and discrimination against these people. Dorian Key, Deidre, yes, but 96% is still 96%, to which Deidre replies, data is always flawed and skewed to promote policies and agendas. And again, Dorian addresses me now. Ben, you really think societal level government competency is related to the euro? Oh, we're getting back to the euro debate now. I had things to talk about, and now, wow, what a discussion we're having. We'll get to the stuff tomorrow, because how long has this been? We've gone over an hour. I got to eat dinner at some point, people. Dorian, Ben, you really think societal level governmental competency is related to the euro? Don't you think the difference in government trust and corruption is cultural, say U.S. versus Finland? Finland has literally eliminated homelessness in their country. Norway has universal income citizens. Universal income citizens get regardless of their working status. Denmark has the highest standard of living and ranks first on the global happiness index. So to your point, some things are cultural. So I agree with that. In the United States is particularly primed for an individualistic set of policies that are not there to sort of, provide things like UBI and social welfare. That being said, however, when you look at Europe and the differentiation between the countries that have performed well and countries that have performed poorly and where populism has risen, you can see that it's not necessarily the existence of a social safety net. It is, yes, competency, but also I would argue that as populism rises, competency goes down because populists aren't known for their technocratic governance. They're known for their demagoguery and their firebrand language, which riles up the population. So in order to have incompetent government, I think you need to begin with a system that is already breeding inequity so that people are ready to accept that the elite who govern society are doing a bad job. Whether we would argue that the technocratic nature of what they're doing is, quote, good or competent, if they're not helping the population, then it's not good for those people. So, a lot of folks would say the United States has had very competent governance for the last 50 years, all the way up until Barack Obama. But who was it helping? Who felt it was competent? Who felt like they were being left behind? Now, some of that is cultural, some of that is political, and the messaging of the government to the people. But ultimately, these are things that break down, and you need to have those weaknesses that can be exploited. Now, again, I do think that the United States is in a unique situation where those weaknesses are constantly exploited by wealthy and special interests as well as foreign nations. And that's something that's been going on since the Cold War. But one of the things that has kept the United States together has been rising standard of living. Same thing with China, right? It's that rising standard of living that makes people feel like, well, why rock the boat? So insofar as the inequality and the feeling that the bottom segment of the populace believes that they're being left behind or that their government's not looking out for them, I think the U.S. actually shares more with the UK, Finland, Spain, and what have you than the other countries you mentioned. And a lot of it has to do with the types of policies they're willing to pursue. And so competency, I would argue, is not, competence is like agnostic. You can be competent at doing terrible things. That's basically what I say about Andrew Cuomo. Every time there's an election, people are like, Cuomo is a great executive. He really gets things done. And I'm like, if he gets things done very quickly, I don't care if he's competent. I would prefer if he were incompetent at doing bad things. So culturally, I do think the fact that those nations are more likely to provide social welfare programs and reduce the inequality between societal strata does play a really big role. But I also think that the culture of the United States has been shaped by the fact that corporations and people who do very well under the current system invest a lot in perpetuating it because there's so much money at stake. Same thing with foreign governments and foreign interests, right? So the fact that there's not a huge budget at stake in Finland, the fact that, military power projection across the globe isn't at stake in Sweden, this means that relative investment of resources in dividing a population and controlling political outcomes is highest in the United States. That's where you want to put your lobbying money and your campaign finance money. That frees up countries to progress, to have their political systems progress in lockstep with their economic growth. The United States got rich beyond its political system to cope with. And that's led to the financial interests controlling the political interests. Whereas in other places, they were able to corral corporate interests because economic power grew up with political power. So you have redistribution of wealth, you've got higher tax rates, you've got publicly funded campaigns and such. Now, of course, we have this Constitution that, you could argue the Constitution constrains America, but it's the interpretation of the Constitution that really matters. And we can do a lot of things in the United States, even given the fact that, we can't limit individuals from spending an infinite amount of money, on their campaigns personally. Still, the contributions from corporations could be limited. Still, the contributions from individuals are limited. Honestly, if corporations are people, they should have a maximum amount of money that they can spend on campaigns, just like individuals. Well, actually, I've muddied the waters on campaign contributions and independent expenditures, but that is a topic for a whole other time. There's a lot we could talk about there. Deidre replies to Dorian, these countries are also homogenous and racist against their immigrant populations. We did not get into the cultural homogeneity argument, but certainly some of the division that's here in the United States is done along racial lines, like the, quote, welfare queen myth that was created. And these myths are created both by racists and by corporate interests that seek to actively divide an American populace from enacting measures that help them and their fellow working class folks, right? Like they benefit a lot from dividing voters. Dorian Key, no way, Deirdre. Denmark has huge support for immigrants. They get years of free language classes and a stipend. Way more support than we, the United States, give new immigrants. This is true, but the percentage of Denmark, which is not Denmarkian, what are they? I forget what they are, but whatever. We should just call, like, why do we have to have different words? Anyway, the point is the percentage of Denmark, which is comprised of immigrants or like non-white people, is much, much smaller than the percentage of the United States, which is immigrant and non-white majority. So the divisions are much more apparent. Giving a few crumbs to a small number of people is different from having a real conversation about the distribution of resources between different communities, many of which have been put down over hundreds of years, depriving them of resources and the aggregation or accumulation of resources that would put them on par with the majority population. Matt Kozlowski, agreed, but with whom? Deirdre Levy, wow. Deirdre, this is like, I will say this. Deirdre's running for city council, so if you like what she has to say, you should check her out. She's running for city council in Brooklyn, and she replies to Dorian Key, Chef Harold Villanosa, native New Yorker and chef at The Stand in NYC, was hired to be the culinary diplomat to Denmark to address the racism and discrimination against the Danish and the immigrant population. Sources are always nice. I will say that both Dorian and Deirdre have practiced good source etiquette by linking to things that prove their points. Dorian Key, above. Interesting. Denmark is a homogenous society. We need to try to see it from their shoes. Yes, but at the same time, it makes the United States puts us in a different situation. Julianne says, agreed, people from all religions, we're going back now to the, we're talking about Bill de Blasio's tweet to the Jewish community and everybody else. Agreed, people from all religions should be called out. My issue with fundamentalism, basically religious people violating social distancing measures because religion, my issue with fundamentalism comes from my experience of evangelical fundamentalism in the South. I found that people who are extremely religious tend to be blinded by their religion. We need to learn how to work within the framework of religion for the benefit of all. We don't need to call people out the way that was done, Bill de Blasio's tweet. Not only was that the tweet bigoted, but it was alienating. We cannot alienate people when we need people to listen. Dorian, I've been to both Sweden and Denmark, and I've never had any problems, and I'm a minority. Well, I'll say this. Just like some people said that hydroxychloroquine cured them of COVID, going to a place and not having a bad experience yourself doesn't mean that they're not racist. I have been to Europe many times, and one of my very first experiences with racism was, in fact, in France, and then in the UK, and then in a friendlies in the United States. But, just say, I go out almost every day and don't experience racism. I, for example, have not once been told that I am a cause of coronavirus, even though I don't dispute that lots of Chinese people and Asian people generally experience this sort of harassment. Deirdre says, you're lucky, but have you lived there? Dorian says, no, immigration to those countries is fairly difficult, which is how they keep the immigrant population low, mind you. If I'm not mistaken, I was there for only a week. Oh, by the way, I just want to point out, I don't know if Jesse Lehman is still around, but Jesse Lehman, friend of mine, and also Jeopardy winner. So, hello, Jesse. Thanks for being super smart, and congratulations. Julianne says, white people from affluent areas are drug users. Okay, way to make blanket statements. I knew many, many upper middle class white kids in my high school who used drugs. They knew they could get off the hook because they were connected. Black and brown people from poor communities do not have these connections. White kids from affluent neighborhoods will buy drugs from black and brown kids from poor communities, but only one gets punished. And now we're sort of merging a bunch of threads all into a single comment. So if you have not been here for the whole time, we've spoken about Bill de Blasio's tweet to the Jewish community and everyone else, contact tracing being run by the person who ran Stop and Frisk, which was pretty racially impactful policy. And we've spoken about the inequalities between rich and poor in countries and how that leads to other political outcomes. Dorian, 100% drugs should be decriminalized. Well, there's the libertarian for you. Dorian Key. Well, maybe not like crystal meth. Oh, we're backtracking already. Julianne, for the Zoom tomorrow, I think you should have just a free-for-all around the topics. Maybe you can let us know what the topic will be for tomorrow so we can research the topics, maybe, and discuss them. I learned so much from these discussions. Okay. Cool. Stay tuned, everybody, for like 3 p.m. when I will release topics. And then also the Zoom information, I guess. Replying to Julian Ballington, Deirdre, and to Dorian, it seems. Deirdre says, read drugs, Dorian Key, more people should read this book by Michael Pollan. Okay. Listen, if folks are interested in drug knowledge, link in the description. Link in the link. Link in the comments. Boom, nailed it. Listen, usually by now I'm like eating the rice and beans that I've made for dinner. This is, again, didn't even get to I think I spoke about 2 of several things I had prepared to talk about with y'all. Listen, this is great though. I much prefer this. This is awesome, and I can't wait to do the Zoom tomorrow. It's going to be fun. Julianne says, agreed. I think harder drugs should not be legal, but others should. We need to change our discussion around drug usage. Addicts aren't criminals. They are sick. We need to address the issues that lead people to dealing drugs in the first place. Dorian says, good luck on city council, Deirdre. Can you help us save the Elizabeth Street Garden? Margaret Chin wants to demolish it. And he put a link in. I love the link hygiene. See, we have great discussions because people are willing to cite stuff. Oh, if I click on these things, I actually get even more comments. Anyway, I don't know how I got to that thing, but Deirdre said yes, although she does not represent that part of the city. It's in Nolita. Chris Barron says, drugs can be fun. I don't think anybody will argue with that. My personal favorite drug is alcohol. I do love a good whiskey. Deirdre says, yeah, I love gardens, especially that one. So I will agree with you on this. And, we could do a whole thing on the Elizabeth Street Garden and how the city council has voted on that. But maybe for another time. And in fact, one of the district leaders of Downtown Independent Democrats, which is doing this great PPE drive, is a leader in that fight to save the garden. So maybe we'll have her on sometime. I don't know if you know in my district, but Margaret Chin seems to only care about her solid, loyal voter base and ignores the rest of us. Not a fan. That's from Dorian. And I would probably argue that, yes, Margaret Chin definitely comes across to many as somebody who only cares about a small segment of the population. And there are many folks who are unhappy with her, which is why she almost lost her re-election bid to newcomer Chris Marte. Only 100 votes difference, 200 votes difference in a race of thousands. That being said, Margaret Chin is now term limited out and does not look to be running for any other elected office. Probably for the fact that she's wildly unpopular, like really unpopular. Like Chris Marte is obviously, maybe not obviously, but Chris Marte is not Chinese, and large swaths of Chinatown voted against Margaret Chin, even though they're her supposed base. Margaret Chin has really not been great about listening to the community on a number of issues, although she has done a lot for seniors. Anywho, look, there were other things. I'm going to see if there was anything else that I wanted to mention that was fast, because now I'm super freaking hungry. Okay. I'll just mention a few things. One, for those paying attention to the news, I'll probably have to mention this tomorrow, I guess, but South Korea released information about the reinfection of people who had coronavirus already. And as it turns out, they weren't reinfected, nor did coronavirus reassert itself or wake up. In fact, the tests were picking up dead viral remains. So people who tested positive for coronavirus in South Korea after testing negative actually have not had a resurgence of coronavirus. However, this does not address the fact that there are people who have reported that they got sick again, and that's problematic. But yes, yeah, it's 10 p.m., Ben. Go eat. Thank you. I will, right after I get through the last two headlines I wanted to mention, which is, one, publicly traded companies have 2 weeks to return all of the small business money that they not stole, but took. So kudos to everybody for being mad at corporations for stealing the small business funds. They're going to have to give it back by order of the Treasury. And I have to say, I am really honestly astonished that the Trump administration is taking money from large corporations. But, he gave them a big enough bailout anyway. I guess it doesn't hurt. And it was definitely going to look bad on Election Day if he let the now $800 billion meant for small businesses go in large part to publicly traded companies. And finally, this is Correspondents' Dinner season. So I just want to remind everybody that once upon a time, the United States had a function called the Correspondents' Dinner, where the press would gather with the White House and people would lampoon and make fun of the president to his face. And Donald Trump got real butthurt when that happened the first time, and he canceled it, and we have been without a Washington tradition ever since, because the president has a gigantic ego. Anywho, Deidre Levy, suggestion for tomorrow, May Day. Holy moly, do people know about May Day? Let's talk about labor. Okay, that's all for tonight, folks. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget, I'm going to pop a link in the description in the comments. But if you care about PPE for at-need communities in New York, Downtown Independent Democrats is doing a partnership with the COVID Foundation that is raising money to supply PPE at cost to residents of New York City, starting with Lower Manhattan. $10 gets a family masks, hand sanitizer, and gloves for 2 weeks. $10. All donations are being matched by DID up to $1,000. So check it out, bit.ly/downtownppe. Capital D, capital P, capital P, capital E. See you all tomorrow at 8:30.